This is Bloomberg Crypto, a daily Bloomberg iHeart podcast, and I'm Stacey Marie Ishmael, managing editor of crypto for Bloomberg News. It's Tuesday, February 28th. Before it filed for bankruptcy last summer, crypto lender Celsius had a devoted following among retail investors. These investors believed in the repeated affirmations from Celsius's charismatic CEO, Alex Mashinsky. Mashinsky would say that these investors were making smart, low-risk financial decisions by trusting their digital tokens to the company. But the reality of what was happening behind the scenes, according to a recent report from an independent examiner, sounds like it was very different. According to the allegations in that report, the risk controls at Celsius were much less thorough and much less sophisticated than what they were telling their customers at the time. That report clocks in at 689 pages, so there's a lot in there. But fundamentally, it alleges that Celsius misrepresented the true financial health of the company in ways that turned out to have devastating consequences for those customers who trusted them. Bloomberg's Olga Karif has read many hundreds of those pages, and she joins me now with the details. Olga, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Today we are not going to talk about FTX.
That's a big change.
Well, it's huge. I know, it's a surprise. But we are going to talk about a company that I think in a lot of ways is equally important to understanding what's been happening in crypto. And that company is Celsius. And again, reminding all our listeners, this is a theoretical example. I do not personally own a bunch of crypto. I do not own any crypto. But if I did own a bunch of crypto, I could have gone to Celsius with, say, $10,000 worth of Bitcoin, for example, and then said, okay, Celsius, I'm going to let you take this money and lend it out to other people, and you will pay me some kind of really high interest rate in return. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And, for years, Alex Mashinsky, CEO of Celsius, he basically said that, if you put your money in a bank, you are basically going to get this tiny little interest, if any. But, it's a smart financial move for you to come to Celsius and actually earn a much higher yield with, he said, low risk.
If I wanted to borrow money from Celsius, what would I do?
So you would come to Celsius, and it depended on who you were, basically. Sometimes people had to put up collateral to borrow from Celsius. But sometimes, as we found out more recently, they didn't have to put up collateral, or not as much collateral as, some customers who kept their funds on Celsius thought they needed to put up. And so that brings us to this examiner report that came out in January that sort of uncovered that there were a lot of discrepancies in between institutional, for instance, and retail borrowers at Celsius.
So when we talk about collateral, because I think this is a really important point, and, it gets to the heart of, as you say, this report that was published just recently. When you talk about collateral in a traditional loan context, it's like, if I want to borrow money to buy a house, I have to pledge some kind of asset in return. That might be a down payment. That might be some other asset that I have. But if I were very wealthy and I owned, say, millions and millions of dollars worth of shares, I could pledge those shares as collateral if I wanted to borrow money to do something else, like build a spaceship or whatever it is that really wealthy people do with their billions of dollars. But the idea is that in the case that I didn't pay my loan back, the bank or the person who lent me money would have a way to at least cover the losses. Is that roughly how that works?
Absolutely. And it worked very differently on Celsius. Let me give you one example. So, for instance, FTX, the exchange that went bankrupt last November, would borrow coins from Celsius, and it would put up its own FTT token, which FTX issued as collateral. Now we know, because FTX collapsed in November, that the value of FTT tokens was very questionable.
Mm-hmm.
And actually people inside of Celsius knew that as well, that it was questionable and probably should not be accepted as collateral, but it was still accepted as collateral. So
Mm-hmm.
those are the type of transactions that Celsius had facilitated.
When I was reading the Examiner report, like one of the things that really jumped out to me was this idea that this wasn't something that happened recently. It's not that these standards only eroded in 2021 or 2022 before they filed for bankruptcy. It sounded like there had been a real pattern of having less than robust risk management for a much longer time.
Absolutely. So Mashinsky and his co-founder, they came up with the idea for Celsius in 2017, and this company the service was launched in 2018, and actually some risk control policies, well, they were not even imposed. There was I think more of a pretense of imposing risk controls. But that only started in 2021, according to the Examiner report. And so one thing that the Examiner highlighted throughout this, almost 700-page report is that this company, they had trouble with accounting. They had trouble with paying taxes. They had trouble with risk controls. I mean, they used QuickBooks and Google spreadsheets to keep track of the coins that were lent and borrowed. And obviously QuickBooks is for small to mid-sized businesses.
Or FTX, depending,
Right.
Everyone's using QuickBooks in crypto, apparently.
Exactly. And the Examiner couldn't even find a lot of the older record keeping. It does not exist, apparently. And the risk control policies, when internal people were suggesting some of this risk control measures, which are pretty standard, that were not implemented. A lot of them were sort of not implemented even after the suggestions have been made and issues have been raised. Alex Mashinsky, according to the Examiner's report, was very focused on pretty much just growing the user base of Celsius and not on anything else.
How does that contrast with what Mashinsky was telling customers at the time?
So at the time, and actually, up until Celsius froze withdrawals on June 12th of last year, essentially Mashinsky was telling everybody, we have enough funds, we have all the funds we need to reimburse everybody, everything is fine. And for actually several months before then, and actually for many months before then, things were not fine. Celsius was recording massive losses. It was spending customer and investor money to prop up its own Cell token. And when things went south last May, when the Terra blockchain collapsed, this was sort of just the last nail in the coffin. But Celsius filed for bankruptcy with a hole in its balance sheet of more than $1 billion. But, a lot of this hole actually happened way earlier than May. Everything that could have gone wrong with this business pretty much did. They borrowed money from a lender, and then the lender refused to give them their collateral back, for example. Or they entrusted their, thousands of Ether to somebody who lost access to that Ether. All kinds of strange things happened in this business. And I think partially this goes back to what you said, the lack of risk controls, and the business wasn't managed well.
Now, Olga, you've been a reporter for a long time. I feel like you've heard people say this before. That, this time for sure we're going to pay attention to the fundamentals. We're not going to just try to chase after the thing that everybody's chasing at. We're not going to overpay for deals. We're going to be really thoughtful and deliberate and really care about risk. And then 3 years later, everything blows up again.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we saw this with, initial coin offerings where VCs were front and center in a lot of them, and made a lot of money on ICOs before that whole space sort of collapsed because of enforcement and regulation. And actually, many VCs ended up just escaping with the money they made, and a lot of the retail users ended up losing all of their money and getting hurt. And I think that's what happened last year, again, with with the collapse of a lot of this crypto lenders, where just a lot of regular people lost everything they had. So I totally agree with you that I think it's just memories are short.
Up next, more from Bloomberg reporter Olga Karif on why Celsius matters in the crypto ecosystem. We'll be right back. I want to go back to something else. This idea of Celsius knew or believed that they owned customer tokens, even while they were saying to customers, no, these are always going to be your assets. Why has this become important in the bankruptcy fight?
During sort of YouTube videos and all kinds of weekly, talks that Mashinsky did with users, he very frequently said that these are your tokens. We don't own them. You, the users, own them. But many users, turns out, hadn't read Celsius's terms of service, at least in the state that they were in the last couple of years. And by the way, this terms of service, there were so many versions of those. It actually was a big part of the proceedings initially, just trying to find all these different versions of terms of service. But in the terms of service, it specifically stated that the users' tokens, if they sit in certain of the more popular Celsius accounts called Earn, in this scenario, Celsius basically owns the tokens. And when Celsius went bankrupt, what that meant is that all of the users whose funds were in this Earn accounts, they became unsecured creditors. And obviously, and the judge actually ruled that the tokens do belong to Celsius, the company, versus the users. And so that essentially dramatically reduced the amount of recovery available to those users.
Right, because unsecured creditors, which is, just like jargon for you're very low down in the repayment order. Like if there's enough assets after we've paid everybody else in this long list above you, great. But otherwise, you're probably not going to get very much if you get anything at all. Now, most people do not read terms of service.
Very true.
You sign up for something, you open a bank account, you download a random app onto your phone from an app store, and there's like, yeah, I've totally read the terms of service. Tick this box, move on happily. Most people do not read the terms of service. Do you think people are going to start paying more attention to these kinds of things because of these collapses, because of how many folks have lost money as a result of them?
After reading the examiner's report, I might be more inclined to read terms of service. But realistically, we are so busy with our lives, right? With everything we do. I mean, who has the time to read, this tens or hundreds of pages in there? And plus, we're not lawyers. Not everybody can understand the legalese that's in the terms of service. And I think it's a real problem because, I imagine that if a CEO of a company during a YouTube video tells you that this is how things are, most people will trust what this person will say and sign up for the service, imagining that this is what they're going to get in the end. But that's certainly not the case, as Celsius showed us.
And this is exactly why various regulators around the world are starting to emphasize this idea of, should there be better consumer protections for people who are investing in crypto? Because the assumption that companies are doing appropriate risk management or even that customers are doing appropriate personal risk management is turning out not to be founded on reality in some of these cases.
Absolutely. I mean, over the last year, so many companies went bankrupt and so many hundreds of thousands of users lost money here in the US because of this. I think this left basically a lot of the regulators here with, essentially a black eye. Where were they when all of this stuff was happening?
Now, I started this episode by saying that we're not going to talk about FTX, and people will be like, oh, why? FTX is so interesting. What should people understand about these other companies in the crypto ecosystem, companies like Celsius, and why they are and continue to be important in order to really get a sense of how this overall marketplace operates?
Like any other market, crypto, I think, thrives on essentially leverage. A lot of people entered this market via leverage where they would, put some money down on a crypto exchange and make bets with, much larger amount of money. If they lose their bet, their sort of collateral, if you will evaporate. So a lot of people have been doing this in crypto for a while, for a number of years. And what this crypto lenders allowed people to do is to even do more complex sort of borrowing and lending strategies and allowed more people to, access to leverage. And, while I would say most of these crypto lenders went bankrupt last year, not all of them, the fact of the matter remains that I think people will find other ways to gain leverage in this market, as they have in others as well. And, I think it just behooves regulators to stay on top of this.
Well, on that cheery note, thank you very much, Olga. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
It was my pleasure. I so appreciate you having me on.
That was Bloomberg reporter Olga Karif. You can find more of her reporting on the Bloomberg terminal and on Bloomberg.com. And if you're interested in all things bankruptcy, because come on, we talk about it a lot on this show, you should check out a new newsletter from our colleagues. It's called The Brink. It's as exciting as it sounds. You can find it on Bloomberg.com. This is Bloomberg Crypto, a daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Send us your comments, questions, or suggestions for the show to crypto@bloomberg.net. The supervising producer of Bloomberg Crypto is Vicky Vergolina. Our senior producer is Janet Babin. Our producers are Mohammed Farouk and Sharon Barrero. Our associate producers are Ty Butler and Moses Undum. Desta Wonderad is our engineer. Original music by Leo Sidran. I'm Stacey Marie Ishmael. We'll be back tomorrow.